So in this section, what we're going to cover is an introduction to simulation neuroscience. First, we're going to look at the approaches to study the brain, and then we're going to go through the rationale, the principles, data strategies, informatics strategies, reconstruction strategies, and simulation strategies. So, after this course, this lecture, the first lecture, you should have an understanding of what simulation neuroscience is. You should have a general idea on how we treat data and our approach to informatics. What do we mean by reconstruction? And what kind of strategies we use to do reconstruction, tissue reconstruction, and what strategies we use for simulation. These are very general concepts. We're going to go in the next lectures much deeper. And you should also have an understanding of what the caveats are for simulation neuroscience. So we're going to look at the approaches to study the brain, because I think we should take a step back and say, how do we advance scientific knowledge? With our three branches of exploratory science, if you wish, to discover new knowledge. One of them is, of course, experimental. That's the ground truth approach. You observe, you hypothesize, you test, and you make more measurements. For the brain, of course, we can look at normal brains, everything from genes, proteins, cells, circuits, cognition, psychophysics, all the way up to behavior. And then, of course, you have nature's experiments, which are the disease brain. You can look at the effect of toxins, the effect of drugs, lesions on the brain, mutations that are occurring, and degeneration with aging. And all of these provide you sort of a repertoire of conditions where you can actually try to understand what the brain is doing. The second is theoretical neuroscience, or theory, where you essentially hypothesize about the data or about the observations. And one can look at them in at least four different categories. There's sort of informatics, which really tries to look at the trends or correlations and patterns in the data. Theoretical neuroscience is trying to explain the data. You see the data, you want to predict the outcomes of an experiment, and you have a theory about the data and your observation. Computational neuroscience is more about building a model to replicate the experimental data, and generally it is to build a minimal model. And the idea is that if you can explain a phenomenon in the simplest possible way, then you have the deepest understanding. It's debatable, but that is the idea of computational neuroscience. Then you have applied neuroscience, where basically you can say that if I really do understand how neurons work, then I can build a device that will listen to them. And I can develop a treatment that will cure them. And that's applied neuroscience. Then there's simulation neuroscience, and this is, in neuroscience, this is new. We're sort of driving this or trying to pioneer this. And the way to think of simulation neuroscience is that it unifies both experimental and theoretical approaches. The difference in simulation neuroscience is that you consider every detail of the brain. Nothing is left out. So, for example, if you had a theory of how language works, and you had a couple of equations that could build a machine that would be able to speak, that would be wonderful. It would indicate that you have a deep understanding of language, but it won't help you understand how a genetic mutation impacts language and how that affects the next neuron and the next circuit and the brain activity and how you should treat it. So simulation neuroscience is about taking all the data into account, all the knowledge into account, and integrating it. And it's also about filling the gaps of our knowledge with hypotheses, because we may not be able to measure everything. Okay, so another way to look at, to get a perspective on the way we approach the brain is that there are individual researchers. And in the world, there are probably around 200,000 individual neuroscientists that are exploring the brain. So they're looking at it at the genetic level, at the protein level, at the behavioral level, and there's a huge repertoire of different techniques that can be used to be able to probe the brain and to assess what's going on. And this is producing a massive range of data. And today there's about 100,000 scientific papers produced by this individual research from all around the world. So there's an enormous amount of data being produced to understand the brain. And we actually do know lots and lots of little pieces. In individual research, every lab has its own method, its own conditions, its own instruments, its own biases. And of course, that means that it's not always easy to compare data and findings across laboratories. And it is quite a significant problem that in neuroscience, a significant amount of the research that's been done in individual laboratories are difficult to reproduce or impossible to reproduce. But nevertheless, they provide a massive source of data and knowledge. The second approach to the brain is to go large scale, to go industrial scale. For example, the way that the Allen Institute approaches brain mapping, or the Human Connectome Project, or some parts of the Human Brain Project, the European Human Brain Project. And the idea there is to standardize. In the case of the Allen Institute, for example, they would standardize all the methods and they will produce 20,000 atlases where each atlas is telling you where one gene is in the whole brain. And so you have 20,000 genes, 20,000 atlases, and they do that very systematically. So you have a very solid, large block of data. So this is large-scale brain mapping, and it's really sort of industrial-scale neuroscience. It's extremely valuable data for simulation neuroscience because it's highly standardized and it's much easier to use. But the individual research is very valuable to actually validate the model, the reconstructed tissues that are built afterwards. So all data is valuable. All approaches are valuable. Then, of course, you have to database the brain, and this has a very long history. There's a lot of efforts that have gone into databasing the brain. It was started in 1990 by Bill Clinton. Actually, he started the US Human Brain Project, which was in an effort to database the brain. It's been a very difficult, very long journey because there are so many different types of data and different conditions and different questions. It's very difficult to decide how to database the brain. But there are now international efforts, and it's also an effort in the European Human Brain Project to database the brain in a systematic way. It's not a solved problem. There's a lot of challenges, and you're going to have a lecture about it in this MOOC series later on how do we approach the data. And then we have, of course, why do we do all of this? In the end, we want to put all the pieces together. And that is reconstruction simulation or simulation neuroscience. Another aspect is which simulation neuroscience and large-scale industry mapping of the brain introduces is really what's called team science. It's very different, where you have a lot of people with different expertise sitting around a table and solving one problem. Very different from the individual that's sitting in the lab and addressing a specific question. It is not whether one is better or worse than another. They're all part of the whole approach that the world today is using to study the brain, and they all play their specific role and they have their benefits in their own particular way. In many cases, team neuroscience is indispensable. It has to be done that way, and in many cases you have to have individual research. let's look now at the rationale. Why do we need to do simulation neuroscience? What's the goal of doing simulation neuroscience? We have experiments, we have theory. Many people say you only need theory, you only need experiments, you don't need to simulate the brain. There's a lot of debate and discussions and all kinds of ideas out there about simulation neuroscience. Why do you need it? Well, first of all, what we have to bear in mind is that actually simulation science is at the pinnacle of almost all the hard sciences. So you go to material science. In the beginning, you were tinkering around with chemistry and materials, and you were building things, you were experimenting how materials work and how strong they are and how flexible they are and so on and so forth. Today, you simulate them. You simulate materials almost, and you can actually simulate a huge repertoire of materials before you actually produce them. In engineering, there's almost nothing that is not simulated today. Toilet paper. Do you realize that you cannot actually produce toilet paper without simulation? These are very fine, very soft tissue that you have to cut in very specific ways, and you have to roll them out at lightning speed in perfect. This cannot be done by experimentation, cannot even be done by theory. You actually have to simulate the physics of the tissue in order to be able to wrap it. Diapers, the space shuttles, they have to be simulated in detail. All the electronics, aircrafts, they are being built through simulations, and then they sent out to fly without even a test run. They just design them, simulate, and they are ready to go. So simulation science is the pinnacle of most of the sciences. It hasn't arrived yet at neuroscience, but, well, it's arrived now at neuroscience. So I want to give you the rationale. Why do we need simulation neuroscience to understand the brain? The first, and actually the main reason, is that understanding the brain is a big data problem. If you look at the numbers, you realize that there's no way that you are going to be able to understand all these pieces and how they interact together. You have 20,000 genes. About half of them are expressed in every cell in the brain. There's about 1,500 that are sort of very overexpressed in the brain, but most cells express about 30 to 50% of their genes. Then they produce around 200,000 proteins, different types of proteins, but each protein has a variant. So you have about 1 million protein variants per cell. Then you have probably, we predict, about 1 billion molecules in a cell. There are thousands of molecular pathways. There are millions of molecular interactions per second in a cell. There are at least 2,000 cell types. So we have about 900 brain regions. In each brain region, there can be at a minimum of 2 types of cells, but in many cases 10, 20, 50 types of cells. So there's well over 2,000 different cell types. In the mouse brain, you have about 1,000 kilometers of fibers. In the human brain, about 1 million kilometers of fibers. In the mouse brain, about 1 trillion synapses. In the human brain, about 1,000 trillion synapses. The mouse brain, about 100 million neurons. In the human brain, about 100 billion neurons. So just for one instance, one age, one species, one strain, individual variations, and one disease, this is everything you'd have to map and understand how they all interact together to give rise to emergent behavior, to give rise to psychophysical properties, to give rise to cognition, to give rise to a behavioral repertoire, and so on and so forth. Imagine if you have to do it for all the ages, all the species, all individual variations, and for the more or less 600 different brain diseases. This is not a problem that we can solve only with experimental neuroscience. Experimental neuroscience is key. It's the ground truth. You have to go back and test, always go back and test and experiment. But there is no way that you can understand the brain if you do not have a strategy where you can look at how all of these elements are interacting with each other and be able to predict and explore how they could be changing the interactions in different states of age, species, and diseases. So it's a big data problem, and there's no theory that's going to solve this whole problem for you in terms of understanding all the details of what's going on in the brain. And there's no one experiment that's going to solve all of this. So for simulation neuroscience, the claim is it's essential for an ultimate understanding of all the components of the brain and how they give rise to us, our personalities and behavior.